Okay, so it looks like we're live. So, Anna, thank you so much for coming to my live stream. And for everybody else who is here or about to join us, thank you for coming to my channel, JPES Talks. So, as you guys know, I made the channel for the tutoring business and just to have a little bit of fun and to have another platform for communication. So, today we're going to talk about special education or special ed, aka SPED. It's got several different names depending on where you're from. And so when I hear special education, the only thing that comes to my mind are the things that I experienced in the classroom. So for everybody who's here, this is my friend Anna. And so Anna, why don't you introduce yourself and just tell everybody what you do, where you're from, and anything else like that.
I'm Anna Denisuk. I live near Toronto, Canada, in Mississauga, and I'm starting my own online tutoring business about teaching students with disabilities in elementary and middle school how to read and write better, mainly reading and mainly writing. And this is based on my own experience having a lot of difficulty writing because I had a lot of anxiety with writing.
So thank you so much for sharing that. When it comes to things like special education, I know a lot of teachers, if we went to school to be a teacher, this was a huge thing we had to talk about. And when it comes to special education, it's like, oh, well, that's not a regular thing. It's perhaps students with special education or like with special needs, they need a specific kind of teaching. So if I were to ask you what special education is, how might you define that?
Special education is when you take a student with an exceptionality, like say they have a learning disability, they could even be gifted, they could have social emotional difficulties like depression, anxiety, or an autism spectrum disorder or ADHD. And basically, special education are those supports put in place to help these exceptional students thrive in the school system.
So if somebody wanted to become a teacher, how would you explain to them what it is, like what it might mean to teach a child that has specific needs, such as the ones you mentioned?
Well, and I did a graduate degree at U of T that was a lot about special education, even though I'm not a certified teacher. It's about making your classroom instruction fit everybody, where like maybe the kids that need a little bit of extra help get paired with like a buddy that helps them navigate like social situations, or they work in small groups, or they have like things explained to them a little bit more like concretely, where like if they don't get metaphors or stuff like that, if they take things literally, they need things to be explained to them very like specifically, or they won't get it.
So when I was teaching, I did have a few classes where they were co-taught, and that meant there was another teacher in the room with me, and that teacher was responsible for maybe 4, 5, 6, 7, possibly even 8 students who were considered special needs. Now you might not really know the difference because when they're in the classroom with everybody, they're participating like everybody else. They're asking questions. They're receiving the information. It's just sometimes it's like differentiated. And so
Mhm.
I've had really probably mostly positive experiences with that. I think I was telling you about the student who this kid, he was super bright. When they get to the high school level, you don't really like the special education teacher has all their paperwork, she has all the background information. So me being the regular ed teacher might not know everything about that student. So we had a kid that he was super sharp. He really seemed like he was actually a very gifted student. And I think you said before, sometimes a gifted student is also special needs. That's a unique situation. But this kid was on time, perfectly every day. He'd come back from lunch. He was the first kid there waiting for us. Like, I'm like, I asked her once, what is his background? Like, why is he considered special ed? He has all the right answers. He's got great handwriting. He's whatever he's done in the past, he's either improved or there's just something else that we don't know. And that's how it can be, don't you think? Like some kids, you can see, okay, they need a lot of help, and other kids, it's like, why are they labeled as special ed when they don't seem like they would be.
And I was telling you about this earlier, is that these kids who are gifted and have a disability are called twice exceptional or 2E, where they have a disability and and they're also gifted. And these students are the students that are very bright, but maybe aren't always motivated to do work that they're not interested in, or maybe they do well in math, but bad at spelling, and their skills are uneven. And honestly, I like these kids the most because they have the potential to make a lot of progress if they're taught properly. But unfortunately, they're also the most misunderstood aspect of uh, the most misunderstood students of all. Like you said, you don't necessarily understand why they're special needs. But I think the reason why these kids are special needs is because they have difficulty with something called executive functioning. And like Jenny asked, what is executive functioning during your last live stream with her and Robert? Executive functioning is basically stuff like planning, organizing, starting tasks, breaking things into smaller steps, beating procrastination, regulating your mood so that you can start when you want to start and not when you feel like it, and stuff like that. And basically, a lot of these kids have difficulty with these processes. So what it feels like is that you're trying to turn on a faucet and you're trying to produce some kind of output, but it just doesn't work because there's some kind of issue blocking
Hmm.
what's going on. Like they really want to be successful, but they can't. And so that's why they're special needs.
Wow, I like the way you put that. You're giving it a visual image. Guys that are listening, feel free to ask us a question because I can actually post your question up on the screen here, which is pretty awesome. Anna, what might be a situation where a special needs student would be ignored, and what can we do to fix that as teachers?
Well, like I had like I'm not sure like it would be ignored. I think that I've worked with like students who are pretty smart, but who also have certain like I had a student who had reading and writing difficulties who very likely possibly was also on the autism spectrum because she had difficulty like articulating stuff, where like it wasn't like I didn't want to get to know her. I was kind of like, so what did you do this weekend? She was like, quite literally nothing. And
Mhm.
so I'm not going to make you talk to me and share information about your life if you don't want to. So instead, we just covered more content. And then we just, from when we switched from online to in person, I mean, from in person to online, I did more like getting her to talk about herself. But even that, she was still kind of uncomfortable because it was difficult for her to think of what to say. So I think because she has such difficulty like expressing herself, that this need, like that she improve her social emotional skills, is likely to get ignored because this is something that really has to be drawn out. Like I had to show her a picture of like a bakery with all these cakes, and she was kind of like, oh, they price cakes like this, blah 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 blah. So she was really smart, but this had to be really 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 drawn out.
Victoria says that she works with children that are on the spectrum. So she's a behavior therapist, so she understands exactly what you're talking about. So, Victoria, if you have other comments or questions, just keep them going. I remember being a student and seeing just it when I think when you're really young, you notice, hey, there's this little classroom over here of students who they have a different schedule than us, and they might, some of them might talk a little bit differently than us, or they move differently based on like a physical need or something. And that's what I used to think special ed was. I thought that meant, well, those kids, maybe they had like an issue when they were born, and so they're not able to like do the typical like academic learning like other kids can, or they do, but they just learn it at a different rate, different level. And did you ever work with those types of students, which I guess you kind of have to be careful with how you talk about them now, because I think there's some really mean words that kids would say years ago that now we wouldn't dare say, but like.
Oh, you're asking if I ever worked with kids with more with people with more physical disabilities? Well, no. Well, no. I've worked with like people and like young adults with reading and writing difficulties, with ADHD, with some on the autism spectrum, with some like that co-occur where some were probably on the autism spectrum and also had reading and writing difficulties and stuff like that. And maybe some of these difficulties were picked up on, but the other ones weren't. And then what you have happen with people who are kind of socially awkward is that you have like nerds marrying nerds, and then they produce a
Mhm.
child that's on the autism spectrum.
That's very
And
interesting.
maybe like the parents don't realize that they might be on the autism spectrum themselves until they have this child.
Hmm. You know, one of my cousins has she has 3 children, and the firstborn little boy, he had a lot of developmental issues. In fact, it was a miracle that he even survived. And like he had a lot of surgeries, he had a lot of issues. So as a result, he is was would never be considered an on level child. He has his siblings have really surpassed him as far as like learning and understanding and academic work. So he might have the body of a preteen boy, but his mind is younger. He's like maybe 5 or 6 years old, and that right there is it really is a true definition of character, because my cousin says that she can learn a lot about who people are based off of how they treat her son, because he might enter a room and be making little noises, or he might want to play with toys that would be typically like too young for him. He might want to throw something in the air and catch it over and over again, and that's his way of coping with life. And he's extremely sweet. He loves like play, and he's like the game maker. He likes making games. But she says she knows that there might be adults who present themselves very well, like teachers that he has had who aren't patient with him,
Mm.
and they misunderstand him. They maybe don't treat him the way he should be treated. And she says it's because they look at him as like a hindrance, maybe, or they just don't understand him because he doesn't fall into any specific category. He's special needs. But what does he have? We like to give labels to people and say, "Oh, he's autistic, so that's why he's that way." Or, "Well, they're dyslexic, so you better give him the easy books." Like sometimes people are quick to judge or selfish. What would you say to that if you see a child who's definitely whatever their need might be? What would you say to sort of help that child be understood more, or like, I don't know, maybe to teach the adult a lesson? Like, what kind of things can be said?
Well, like I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying, and I kind of agree, but at the same time, labels are good and helpful because they help predict behavior and they help get you services in the school board. I was at an IEP presentation yesterday where the woman in charge of making the presentation was kind of like, you have to get a psychoed assessment to sometimes force the principal of your school to get your child an IEP so this child can get services. So while it's unfortunate that these labels and this stigma exist, it also serves a purpose because it helps classify people. Obviously, people aren't defined by their label, and that somebody can still have a disability and be capable of a lot of great things. But the fact that these labels have the stigma around them doesn't necessarily mean that we should throw them out.
Raylan made a comment here. She said, "Don't you have to fit into one of the categories under IDEA to be classified as special needs?" So usually when students are young, they're tested, and so a lot of these tests are going to determine their track through school for the rest of their academic career. And so I think that's where it's really tough, because like you were saying, a student might be really good in one area, but their test results, it's just hard to really pinpoint what it is they need. Or sometimes they're in a classroom it's too easy for them, but yet they're not able to learn as well as they should in a on-level class. How would you answer her question, though? Do you know much about like how might they do this in Canada?
Like the IDEA is American, so I don't know that much about American law. But what I do know is that like in the school system, you can still have an IEP and get like accommodations. It's called a school-based IEP, where you're not officially recognized, but you can still get some services. You get extra time on tests and stuff like that, but you're basically kind of screwed if you switch schools or there's a new principal or stuff like that. And then, or you could go like the more official route, get a psychoed assessment done, basically kind of force the principal to get your child accommodations if the school doesn't recognize that your child has special needs, and then go through it that way. So there are many ways to give your child accommodations and the support that they need. And like even doctors will say, your child is smart, don't label her or him.
Mhm.
But at the same time, if you don't have the label, you don't get the supports.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I've had some students in the class who, they had that teacher that would give them accommodations, but when we will offer accommodations, like, hey, do you need extra time? Do you want to go into, like, Miss So and so is going to take 5 or 6 of you, or you can say, not just you kids on the special ed roster, but she's going to take a few people out for smaller group testing. I'll take 1 or 2 other students and you guys can go with her. And sometimes they'll be like, no, I'm fine. And, especially at secondary level, they're able to determine like what they need and what they don't need, which I thought was pretty cool. I like that about older kids. Like they know if they need a longer time for testing. They know when they need like quiet time. So she said that's like the 504 plan in the US. Yeah, 504. Boy, if you're not following that and letting students know, if you're getting major trouble, because those kids, fortunately, they're protected by law. But it's I don't know about other school systems, but in the public school system, it's quite a lot to have all this information. If you have a lot of kids in your room, 30 kids, and 10 of them are considered special ed, it's just a lot, because you want to be able to help each
Mhm.
person with a specific need. And sometimes you don't want to ask too many questions like, hey, what is it that you're really struggling with? You can't ask that in front of everybody. And
No,
maybe
you can't.
as a tutor, though, when you're working one-on-one with these students, do you think that the student can learn better one-on-one versus a classroom of 30 students?
Yes, absolutely. And this is why I got into private tutoring and why I prefer to work with students one-on-one versus in the classroom. Firstly, because I always knew that I wouldn't fit into the public school system, because there's just too much noise, too much information, too much stuff coming at you all at once. And I asked like a high school teacher, how do you determine what to pay attention to? She was like, oh, I just ignore half of it, which has its own hazards. And so this is why I got into private tutoring. Yes, I do feel that these students do work better one-on-one or with or in a small group, because you can customize what it is that they need. You can specifically target the areas that they have difficulty with so that they make quicker progress. Like even also, again, with the giftedness thing, there are some people that are pretty good at some things and not so good at other things. Where like if you can really work with that person one-on-one, they probably will make quicker progress than if they have to kind of stay at the level of everybody else. But that's also a good thing about being an adult, like being in secondary school, being in university, where I found being in university uh, to be much easier than being in elementary and secondary school, because you can make your own schedule. You don't have to take as many courses if you don't want to. You don't have to do stuff as quickly. You can work, you can volunteer, you can do whatever you want. And that's where I've really thrived, because I could really customize my schedule to what I was personally interested in. Unfortunately, this is the area transitioning to post-secondary education where a lot of these people with disabilities or with mental health issues fail, because they honestly don't understand that you can customize your schedule and take fewer courses if you feel overwhelmed. They just kind of assume that like you get a schedule or these are the courses that you have to take. That means that you automatically have to take so many courses in every semester. And so that's why a lot of these people who maybe did well in a more structured environment end up kind of like, no.
You told me about a professor with dyslexia. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I had a professor at Boise U of T named Todd Cunningham, and it's really, really obvious that he has pretty pronounced reading and writing difficulties. Like he has difficulty sounding stuff out, phonemic awareness, and with rapid naming, where he has difficulty retrieving information in his head. And like on one hand, he has difficulty with these things, but on the other hand, he's very charismatic. He's a good public speaker. And what he did in class that I liked was that he was very, very good at reading the emotional climate of the room, and adjusting his teaching to what students needed. Like if people had questions about a specific area, he would adjust what the class was talking about so they got their questions answered. And he was just good at teaching some of the more practical stuff that other people at Boise kind of neglected. And he said something, and other people who work with people with disabilities take this kind of perspective that I actually kind of disagree with. He said, and my friend Victoria, who's watching this, also said that having a disability isn't that a disability isn't a disability, it's just a different ability. And I understand why people take that perspective, especially somebody who has a disability, where if what's different about you is something that you own and that you're open about, that normalizes it, and that means that it's something that can't be used against you. At the same time, though, you have like people who have a disability who do have significant barriers towards participating in society. Like, yes, you may have these strengths, but you still have reading and writing difficulties. And there are people who are on the autism spectrum who end up going to college, university, and getting degrees and doing well in while they're still in school, and then just failing in employment because employers don't know how to accommodate them, they don't know how to help them. And then you have these people who have even stronger skill deficits, where maybe they do well academically because that's what society is pushing them to do, and then they go out in the real world and they can barely carry a conversation with another human being. So they develop the academic skills at the expense of these social emotional skills like time management, emotional regulation, knowing how not to procrastinate and stuff like that. And I found generally in my experience in dealing with people like that who have employed me, that it's emotional intelligence, being able to quickly like read a room and like kind of see things from other people's perspectives, that determines success and not IQ.
Being a teacher, I often just have this drive to just hurry up and make people understand the academic content. Like, how will they just need to learn? If only they'll read, they'll be successful in all areas of life. But that's not the answer for everything. And so,
No.
what can we do? You know, no matter what grade you teach or like the age of your students that you're tutoring, what can tutors do to not only help their students with their homework and with their other academic content, but how can they help them in like a social, emotional way?
Well, I was talking to you about this earlier, is basically just to play a game and discuss like what you're doing, the turn-taking strategies, maybe including maybe suggesting that student join a club based on what they're interested in, or maybe just even play a computer game like on Discord or on their Xbox, where they play with somebody else around the world instead of playing just by themselves, stuff like that. Of course, in like this day and age where COVID is going on, some parents will be like, no, I don't want my child going outside. So there's not that much we can do in terms of that, but we can suggest that parents like have Zoom meetings where kids like draw together or stuff like that.
So Raylan's saying she has a son with autism, and so she's thinking that he sees the world differently than us, and it's like a really cool thing. It's a beautiful thing, and so public school might be difficult. Some kids, actually, I knew one kid back when I was substitute teaching. There was only maybe one or two students who were deemed autistic, and so and you could kind of tell. One little boy, he was quiet, but he would always have this thoughtful look on his face, and I heard, I don't know if this is ridiculous or not, but I heard that students who are autistic, they might have the ability to like count cards and gambling or something. I don't know if you've ever heard of that or if that's just kind of out of this world, but I don't know. I think sometimes like having that type of disability, I can see where your professor was saying, "Whoa, well, actually, it just means you have an ability to see things differently." And maybe it's nice. Maybe it means you're more intelligent in one area and more naive in another. And maybe that's a nice way to be because we as human beings are so overly critical of everything. I know when I was around other teachers, teachers would act a certain way in the classroom, but then you look at everything, like all the deficits a student had, and you say, "This is so frustrating. Like I wish they would just understand, or I wish I could help them, but I don't really know how to reach them." So one of my closest friends has always had a heart for students with special needs, and she was in a classroom where they had a room that if like for the kids who had if they had an emotional breakdown that day, it was just they had a bad day, they could go into this room and they had all these sensory toys and little things that lit up and like little boxes like blocks where things are soft, like they couldn't hurt themselves or like damage anything, but they could go and kind of just recharge and relax. And I think only some schools can allow or can afford this type of thing. Have you ever heard of that, like extra sensory? There's a word for it. I don't know the word. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, yeah, a sensory room and like little cubes where people can kind of like go and relax. Actually, York University had stuff like that in like their assistive technology lab for students with autism. And this is why it's important to choose like the school that your child goes to carefully so that they have the correct supports. That's like, it's also why a lot of parents who can afford it send their kids with special needs to private schools. Of course, private schools aren't always worth the money, and then the smaller class sizes and stuff like that. And then what if it shuts down? But the advantage is that private schools are up and running much sooner than public schools in this kind of a crisis, because if they don't operate, they don't get paid.
I've seen a lot of students, if like all my experiences are going back to the class, and that's when you see just so much more. But I remember seeing students who they were from families that couldn't afford the environment, like a more like a smaller environment. So they would be in school and they probably liked the social aspect about it, like in one of my videos I was talking about homeschooling versus public schooling. And the good thing about public school, you've got a lot of kids really are nice kids. Like they'll make friends with the kid who's a little different, and it doesn't really matter. I've seen kids be very understanding and like very thoughtful for to kids who might be different, but then they may not be getting that learning environment that they need, or they're kind of doing okay, but they'll slip through the cracks. And that's like, I think parents would really fear that their kids slipping through the cracks. And like, I worked with a lady who had a daughter who I think it's interesting when the older kid is the one with like the disability,
Mhm.
because they look older, they look more mature, but their minds might not match up with that. They think differently than other folks would. So she said, my daughter, once she's over 18, she'll have to live with me for the rest of her life unless she gets like very specific care. She said, she can do some things on her own, but she would never need to be alone in her house where she's using the stove and paying the bills. Like those are life skills that maybe a lot of kids won't be able to do. And I don't know, it's tough because it really takes a specific person, like a special person, to really, I don't know, I guess help kids like learn those life skills plus academic skills. Do you know anybody like, anybody who might be autistic, or anybody who's whatever you would call it, whatever label we'd say, like, are they living on their own, or perhaps maybe still living with like family members?
Like, it depends. It depends. I think a lot of these people on autism spectrum are probably living with their parents, but then even typically developing people are still living with their parents, because I live in the GTA and the cost of living is through the roof. So maybe if you ask somebody who lives in Canada where the cost of living wasn't so high, you'd get a different answer.
Hmm.
And like this is also why you put accommodations in place, like extra time on tests, and maybe these kids need to learn life skills instead, and maybe they use assistive technology to help them like scribe or write or have them or have like an audiobook read to them and stuff like that instead of uh, like decoding all the words themselves. Like there are a lot of supports, and this is why being able to advocate for your child and giving your child the skills to advocate for themselves is so important. Like I was at a workshop that was run by a mother who is the executive director of this I think it's the Learning Disabilities Association of Halton Hamilton or something like that. And she has a daughter with a disability. And so the fact that she has a daughter with a disability informs her work. And she tells stories about like her daughter and stuff like that, how she advocated for her, where like the school board was kind of like, we don't think she's disabled enough to have an IEP. Her mom's like, no, I want my child to have the support. And this is also where people run into problems, where people who are more educated about kids with special needs and what they require, it's those kids whose parents are more knowledgeable that end up getting the support, and the other kids whose parents maybe are not as knowledgeable, like maybe they're immigrants, maybe they're poor, they're from a different culture, they are a person of color. It's these people that are more marginalized that end up not getting the support.
Maybe one way to sort of help the kids, like kind of like close that gap and bring people together is to try to, I wonder if those parents who are really proactive, I wonder if they can try to form a support group. I know at my church, they're a big enough church to where they have like a prom night. They call it,
Mm-hmm.
what do they call it? Night Under the Stars, or they give it like a cool name. And so they allow those kids to like have their own prom, where they come, they dress up, and a lot of kids, like they might be like, they have a walker, or they might have like what is it that they have? Like you just know that, okay, these kids, they aren't like regular ed kids, but they still come and have like a wonderful time. And it is honestly, it kind of just looks like normal prom, but they're there, they get to feel special. They have like a prom king and queen, and it's not just that, like that brings the community together, but it's also like that means parents, kids, people are coming together to support one another, because I think raising kids and trying to educate kids is hard enough, but especially if they have some type of um I hate saying disability, but I guess that's what we're going to call it. Like if they have some type of thing about them that holds them back academically, or if they have learning delays, it just makes life harder. So that's where I think a community needs to come into play. Like it's not something you could do by yourself. And I think maybe students feel, or parents in particular feel isolated if they think, I'm the only one dealing with this 18-year-old that acts like a 5-year-old and life's tough. You can't go on like that. I think people need to try to come together. Raylan said our Special Olympics. Yeah. Did you guys have like anything like that, Special Olympics?
I think we have. Like I don't look into stuff like social events like stuff like that because it also strikes me as kind of like cutesy. I don't like stuff like that very much.
Well, I guess the younger kids do. I remember being in high school, and our health occupations class would host the Special Olympics, like the big event every year. And so that meant kids from our area would come to the high school, and you were assigned to a kid. If you volunteered, you were assigned to a student who was special needs, and you got to escort them around, and they got to do like the 100-yard dash, or the softball throw, jump rope. Because a lot of those kids aren't going to compete with Joe Jock from the senior
Yeah.
football player or something. Those kids are competing against one another, and
Yeah.
they love it, and they can win prizes and their snacks, and it's that just another way to bring the community together, and they can make friends that way instead of feeling like they're in school with the masses.
Yeah, it's cute. But also I don't like sports.
Well, you can kind of tell that the people who would volunteer for these types of things, those people end up becoming the nurses, and they become the special ed teachers. Like I know in Georgia in particular, I was always told, well, if you want a job teaching, you need to be certified in special education because there's such a
Really?
yeah. I remember hearing that and thinking, well, I don't know how to teach students like that. Like, actually, it's funny. I have some students now as a tutor who would be considered like they're not it's more like little minor things, but still things that keep them from learning quickly and easily like other students. And
Hmm.
I remember thinking, I don't know exactly what that means. That's you have to love them in a specific way. And I was like, I don't know how do you have the patience for special ed kids? But I've known a lot of people who do, and they're very good at it. So I think, I don't know. Do you think it's a calling, or do you think, no, it's just, if you don't understand kids with certain needs, you better get over it?
Like, I think it's a calling, but I also think it takes practice. And I also think that, like, whoever supervises you, whoever gives you the support, like, I had a boss at this reading clinic who was very caring and very well meaning, but who did not have, like, the education or the communication skills necessary to properly explain things to people, where we were basically left to our own devices, where, like, you probably experienced this as a teacher, where like the principal and the administration determines a lot. So if they're supportive, you feel you can do your job. But if they're not supportive, you basically feel like you're running on empty. So I'm basically left that job because, like, well, she did mean well, and while I did learn something from her about relating to maybe people who are not as educated as you, my overall impression of the situation was that it wasn't like the right environment for me, and that I'm honestly better off working online. It's less distracting. It's also less distracting for the kids. My very first student has a bunch of issues with and stuff like auditory processing disorder, where his mom sticks him in front of the computer with like his big headphones and stuff like that, where he's probably a lot less likely to get distracted because he's with me one on one instead of having to deal with all these people and stuff like that. And it just gets exhausting being around other people constantly.
Well, it's a wonderful thing that kids like that can do well by learning through the internet.
Mhm,
That's not like, oh, well, it's bad if you can't socialize at all. But
mhm,
there are still so many ways and tools like I've talked about, was it Flipgrid, where the kids,
mhm,
if they struggle to read and write, they can create
mhm.
a video. I've been using that. Any kid can use it, and it's great. So guys, Anna has a student coming up in 5 o'clock, and I don't want her to miss that student or to not be prepared enough. So, Anna, do you have any maybe last minute stories or comments for everybody?
Well, like, it's important to teach people and kids with special needs to advocate for themselves, to say what they need and want, and to behave in a way that motivates them to help themselves, that isn't like too cutesy or infantilizing. That's why I don't like the Special Olympics stuff, because it seems like very cutesy. It's also kind of exclusionary, where you put all the special ed kids together in a big group. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have anything in common.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think we as tutors need to keep coming up with ideas and ways to, help our students that have
Mhm.
needs and to be able to relate to them while still being able to teach them. I mean, sometimes, it could be any student. They look back at that teacher and they might not say, "Oh, you really helped me learn to read." They just say, "Oh, I really loved you, Mrs. So and so, because you made me feel better about myself," or,
Mhm.
you helped me, you made me feel better, or you always encourage me. And I think that's really probably the most important thing, is loving all of our students, no matter what their quirks are, no matter what their abilities or disabilities might be. And, it shouldn't be hard to do. That's why we're teaching. We're like, I feel something. I feel some type of way about these students. I want to help them, no matter what their background is. So, um, hey, Wise Science. She told you had great advice, of course, because you.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Jenny.
Oh, all right. Here, that view kind of looks better. All right, guys, thanks so much for tuning in. We'll probably have another live stream again because this is awesome. It's a good learning experience. This will be recorded, so you guys can share it. In fact, please do, because it helps us out. So thanks so much for coming in. Have fun tutoring this afternoon, and we'll see you guys next time.
All right. Bye-bye.